Hello, and welcome back to my darkroom. It's been a while since I made one of these videos, and to be honest, I haven't been shooting all that much during the past year. But I figured I wanted to try out a theme that I don't think gets a lot of coverage, and that is working with old and expired materials. The last time I mixed up a batch of Developer was actually about a year ago. But it wasn't just any Developer. It was this Moersch, I'm probably mispronouncing that, Eco 4812, which has this unique property that the working solution actually may have a usable shelf life of up to 8 months. Well, now it's been about 12 months. But I still have this huge jug of it mixed up. I mixed it up because I wanted to be able to do 16 by 20 prints. But because it lasts so long, the idea is that I can just go ahead and just keep using this whenever I feel like printing, and don't have to worry about putting chemicals down the drain. Now, in addition to this, there's also my stop and fixer, which are not quite as aged. I mixed these up in September, but you know, it's still been a while. So what I'm going to do is pour these chemicals out into trays, and we're going to see if they still work. For the fixer, which I'll probably test first, there are a few ways to know if your fixer is still good. So the standard way everybody talks about is this stuff called hypocheck. The problem I have with this is we don't really know what this is testing for. It's testing for a specific silver concentration, but what silver concentration? Who knows? They don't really specify. And when you look at Ilford's datasheets on their fixer, they actually do give some guidelines. They say it should have a pH between 5 and 5.5, and depending on your use, they list a couple of different silver concentrations. For film, 8 to 10 grams per liter is considered okay. For paper, commercial use, they say anything less than 2 is probably fine. Of course, for max stability, they recommend no more than 0.5. However, at the bottom of that section of the datasheet, they also give a little paragraph saying that RC paper can probably be fine if it's processed in anything from 4 to 6. So, what does hypocheck test for? I don't really know. But we can actually find out what the actual silver concentration of my fixer is. And we do it with this stuff. These are test strips that you immerse in the fixer, and then you compare them against this chart on the side, and it will actually tell you the pH and silver concentration. So we're going to start with doing that and see where we're at. Even if we're not ideal, I'm probably still going to go ahead anyways, but it'd be good to know. Then, in order to see if the developer still works, I think I'm just going to run some paper through it and see what happens. Now, I'm not entirely sure what happens when paper developer is past its useful working life. I've heard some people say that you just don't get full Dmax on the paper. Well, we'll measure that. We'll process the paper, and we'll see what the densitometer tells us. Now, Ilford actually lists what the Dmax should be, and the Dmax would be the max density, or how black it gets, for a couple of their papers. In particular, in some of the new data sheets comparing their newer Generation 5 RC paper to their older Generation 4. They say that the Generation 4 should have a Dmax of up to 2.05, and the newer stuff should have a Dmax of up to 2.15. Now, I've never measured the old stuff, but I actually have measured the new stuff, and I think I was able to get at least 2.11, and I'm going to assume that's still within a margin of error, so we'll see if I get in the ballpark. Now, if using old chemicals wasn't interesting enough, I think I'm also going to start by trying to use old paper. So, I have this box of Ilford MGIV RC that I think I actually purchased for a photo class I took in high school in 1998. It doesn't look that different from the newer boxes. It has a price sticker. Looks like I apparently paid about 50 bucks for it, which is, I guess, half the price of what this sells for now. It also hasn't been very well kept. It's just been stored in boxes as I've moved throughout the years. So I don't really know if this paper is still any good, but I want to find out. So I think for my first test, I'm going to cut a strip of this and see what happens. If this paper doesn't turn out, I do have a new box or newer box of exactly the same stuff. Hopefully, this will be fine if that isn't. And for most of my everyday printing, I've actually switched to the newer Generation 5. So, you know, worst case, we can fall back to this. But I still have all this left over because Generation 5 was released right after I set up my darkroom and bought this. But before we do any of that, I really want to see if this old paper from 1998 still works. Now, assuming we get to that point and everything is still good, I think what I'm going to try to actually print is an old negative. And 1998's not old enough for me. I actually have the film from my first darkroom experience in summer camp when I was probably about 10 years old, from 91, give or take. And a lot of the negatives from that roll are not in the greatest of condition. They've kind of collected muck over the years, but I'm gonna try one and see how it prints, just to make the circle complete. So, without further ado, let's pour the chemicals and get started. So the instructions for the test strips say to put a strip in the fixer for about 1 second, then shake it off, wait 30 seconds, and then measure it. So I've poured the fixer into a separate special little cup, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Okay, so it's sometimes hard to really judge this, but it looks like the pH is between 5 and 6, and the silver concentration might be ballpark between 1 and 2. 2 and 3 look very similar on the thing here. But yeah, I'm gonna say that the fixer is probably still okay. Just for kicks though, I'm gonna see what the hypocheck says. So the hypocheck instructions basically say put in 2 drops and see if a white precipitate forms. And it actually does. So the hypocheck says the fixer is not good, but the test strip says that it's probably still fine. As I was saying earlier, a big open question is what exactly is the hypocheck testing for? I wouldn't be surprised if it was actually testing for 0.5, but they never actually tell you. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and use it and we'll see what happens. Now, the first paper test checking for Dmax is actually going to be really simple. All I do is take a simple test strip, and then cover half of it and expose the other half for a long period of time under a reasonably bright light. Then we process it and compare the two. That's 15 seconds in larger lens, all the way open, no filters, better be enough. Now this Moersch Eco developer can take up to 3 minutes to process, so it's a bit slower than the Ilford multigrade developer that most are used to. So we're going to start the timer and watch the paper, see what happens. Yeah, look at that. Perfectly black and white. I don't think I want to test anything else. I'm just going to go ahead and finish washing this, dry it off, and we'll measure it. Okay, now it's densitometer time. As you can probably see, I actually have two densitometers in here. I have an X-Rite 810 and a Highland TRD2. We're going to be using the Highland today because it seems to be working a bit more reliably right now. The X-Rite has been acting a little wonky, especially on his blue channel, and its calibration just doesn't seem to be working. I honestly blame temperature. It's not good for a very broad temperature range, and it's a bit cool in here today. But I'll deal with that later. The Highland is a lot less fickle because it's a more modern instrument. It just doesn't work as well for color and doesn't work as well for, I guess, what I would call absolute measurements. However, I did zero it on the reference strip that came with it, so we're going to use that as our zero base. Okay, so taking the strip of paper, first let's see what the white is. The white is showing at just below 0. So let's just keep this consistent and zero it on the white. And relative to that, the black is 1.97. That's pretty good. I think Ilford's datasheet said that it would be up to 2.05, and it's unclear if that's above the paper base or based on the absolute standard. So I think it's fair to say that we've nailed it on Dmax. That being said, I think it's time for us to go grab some negatives and try printing something. Back in 1991, when I was about 10 years old, I spent a summer at Camp Wigwam. And what did I do there? I took a photography class. And what's pretty cool about that class is I actually still have all of the negatives. These negatives appear to be Kodak Tmax 400, and I'm not entirely sure if I shot them on whatever junky point and shoot I probably had at the time, or on my mom's Pentax Spotmatic, which I switched to around this point in my life. All I can tell from looking at the negatives is the frame lines aren't perfect and are sometimes slightly misaligned around the sprocket holes. In any case, the negative that I'm going to try printing first is one that actually shows the lawn in front of the lake in the main area of the camp that has this teepee next to a fire pit. A lot of these negatives weren't very poorly kept. I found some of them rummaging around the bottom of a box. These print file sleeves are actually new, so this negative might have some junk on it, but I'm going to try printing it anyways. Okay, it's test strip time. Let's get out a strip of paper that we cut earlier. Get it positioned a decent part of the frame, probably near the bottom where the teepee hits the grass. Get my little test strip jig on top of it. I actually wound up designing and 3D printing this myself because I can never trust myself to move a piece of cardboard in the right increment. So let's go ahead and do a test strip. I'll save you the waiting and let's skip forward to when I have the thing completely processed, fixed, and in the wash. Okay, this one looks a little dark and contrasty. I think I'm gonna go ahead and drop the time down a little bit and maybe drop the contrast filter down a smidge too and do another strip. Also, the picture doesn't look anywhere near as sharp as the negative does, though that could just be because I wasn't using a very good camera. Okay, second test strip looks a little bit better. Contrast might still be a bit too high. Picture looks still a little fuzzy, but again, that could just be the source. I'm tempted to just go ahead and make a straight print around, say, one of these two marks, and we'll see how it turns out. Okay, this will be grade 3, 11.7 seconds. Let's go for it. There we go. There's our first print. The sharpness looks kind of terrible, which probably means I was using one of those junky point and shoots. The contrast still looks a little off. Maybe I should have done this at a grade 2 instead of a grade 3. Also looks kind of hazy and foggy. I don't know if that's the paper, the chemicals, or the film. To be honest, any of those are possible. But just for kicks, since I have a box of the exact same paper that I only bought, about a year or two ago, I'm gonna go ahead and make another print using the new Ilford MG4 with exactly the same settings, and we'll see how it turns out. Now, I would not be surprised if the exposure winds up being completely different because of when it was manufactured and how old it is. Behavior is probably not gonna match, but just for curiosity, exact same settings, new paper versus old paper, what does it look like? Okay. The new print is ready, and there is an enormous difference here. Take a look at that. So, the print on the newer paper, the exposure turned out completely different, much lighter. Actually. The sharpness is about the same, but that's probably the fault of the negative. I could probably improve this with a little bit more fiddling, but yeah, this kind of has a hazy look, and this it almost looks like it needs more exposure, maybe even bumping up the contrast. So I'm wondering if it makes any sense to attempt to make this one look better, maybe dropping the contrast down another grade and fiddling with the exposure time a little more, or if it's not really worth it. The picture was shot on a camera that probably was designed assuming you'd never look at anything bigger than a 5x7, so in an 8x10, yeah, the sharpness really leaves a lot to be desired. Yeah, then again, you can see some texture in the sky here that you can't see at this exposure, so I don't know if it's just the sensitivity is different or if this just is completely junk now. I think I'm gonna give this one another try or two, and we'll see what turns out. Okay, I think this is about as far as I'm willing to go with this particular negative, but I printed it again at grade 2 here and then a half a stop darker here, This is probably the best that I've been able to pull off today from this negative of all of these. It still looks a little hazy, even if it does get all the way to black over here. Hard to tell if it's the fault of the paper or the negative. Again, it could be either. I probably should try printing a new negative on this paper just to see what happens. But the whole point of this exercise was to use the old materials you have laying around and see what you can make out of it. And there you go. This paper, even though it's 20 years old, still works. It still gets to max black. I'm not sure how well it does in between. Its exposure response is also completely different from the newer MG4. I don't know if that's due to Ilford's fault or simply due to the age of the paper. Either way, it's still kind of an interesting exercise to compare the two and see how it does. So, after finishing the last print, I decided to go ahead and pick a different negative and see how it would turn out. The overall results are, I guess you could say, a little similar. This is again all the old paper. First here we have grade 2, then I printed it again at grade 0, and then split the difference, dropped down up to grade 1, and dropped the exposure by about 1/4 of a stop. And I think this is the one I like the best, but I'm not thrilled with any of them. They all still seem to have that sort of haze effect, either due to the old paper or the old negatives, and that lack of critical sharpness, probably due to the camera. It's still a decent photo. This is, I believe, one of the counselors at the camp doing a painting. It's been so long, I don't even remember who this is, but I figured it'd be interesting to try another negative just to see how it turned out. If you've been following me for a while, you should know that I'm one of those analytical types who can't leave well enough alone. So when I was done with those test prints that I showed earlier, I decided, what the heck, let me go ahead, get out my step wedge, and characterize that old paper, old developer combination that I've been using, and actually see how it compares. So in front of you, this is the 20-year-old MG4 Glossy, then the, I guess, 2-year-old MG4 Pearl, and I guess the 1-year-old MG5 Pearl. These were all done with the exact same exposure and a number 2 contrast filter. As you can see, they all look different. So I'm going to let these dry, and then when they dry, I'm going to stick them on the densitometer and actually see how the characteristic curves compare. Now, why did I do the MG5 paper? Well, that's actually the only paper here that I've characterized this way before, so I have a baseline against what it looked like when I did the exact same test when I had first mixed up this batch of developer last year. So that's a good comparison to filter out that variable. So I've measured the step wedge all the way from steps 1 to 16, and then I've measured the same on all 3 exposure strips, along with the base relative Dmax values. Now it's time to go plug this all into a spreadsheet and see what the graph looks like. So it's the next morning, and I spent some time last night going through all that data that I collected off the step wedges and the densitometer, and I put them into a couple of spreadsheets over here. Here is the spreadsheet from all the tests we did yesterday, and over here is an old spreadsheet I did about a year ago when that batch of chemistry was freshly mixed. And so what I'd like to do is go ahead and review what I found. both in terms of how the old box of Ilford Multigrade 4 compares to the new box, and in terms of how the new box of Multigrade 5 compares to the same paper when this batch of chemistry was freshly mixed. As part of doing this, one thing I'd like to go through first is a quick review of how papers are characterized and what all these numbers and graphs in the paper datasheets actually mean. Printing papers are characterized according to this chart right here. Now, paper sensitivity is measured on a logarithmic scale. However, unlike film and camera exposures, it's a slightly different scale. So paper and densitometer measurements are on a log base 10 scale, and stops of exposure, as we're used to from cameras, are done on a log base 2 scale. However, you can convert between the two. In any case, the characteristic curve of paper looks kind of like this. I'm not going to go too far into detail on here, but basically there's 3 points that are of interest. There's this point near the bottom, which is the minimum density, essentially. There's a point in the middle known as the speed point, and this point near the top that's about 90% of the maximum relative density of the paper. Now, paper is usually characterized in the datasheet by two numbers: the ISO-P, or the speed, and the ISO-R, or the contrast range. The ISO-P, or speed, is basically the amount of light required to hit the density at this speed point. Meanwhile, the ISO-R, or the contrast range, is basically the difference between these 2 points closer to the extremes. This doesn't directly relate to film speed, just simply because, as I said, it's done on a different scale and the reference points aren't exactly the same. However, you can use this pretty easily to compare between papers. I can't get speed points from my own tests to line up with datasheets exactly because I'm probably measuring light a little differently than they are, but the contrast ranges do line up, so it is a useful comparison. Now, if we look at the graphs comparing, and I did all these tests with the same filter, same enlarger height, same light, same everything, comparing the old box of Multigrade 4 paper to the new box, they look very different. The contrast ranges are different enough that the old box is actually about a grade lower in its effective contrast for the same filter than the new box. And the paper speed is very different. The old paper is actually nearly a stop faster. It's not clear if this is due to the effects of age, or if this is really just due to the fact that maybe Ilford reformulated their paper in the past 20 years. I really don't know, because it's harder to find those old data sheets. However, the data doesn't really look wonky, it just looks different. Now, a more interesting test for most of you is probably the effects of old chemistry. So this is the same exact box of paper, the Multigrade Generation 5, tested both when I first mixed this batch of chemistry and after this chemistry has been sitting as a working solution for about a year. Now, what did I find comparing these two? The contrast range was basically the same within a reasonable margin of error, so I'm going to assume that that didn't change at all. But the speed point did change. With the chemistry about a year old, the paper got about 0.6 of a stop slower. So this is something that you can compensate for, but otherwise it's pretty much unaffected, so you just gotta be aware of the exposure difference and you're probably okay. So, what did we learn from this? Well, first, that you can deep dive a little bit too far down trying to validate and characterize materials that most photographers would just throw out and not bother with. And to be honest, you probably shouldn't waste your time with old chemicals and old paper. But if you want to see what happens with them, it's still kind of interesting. In any case, I think what I want to do now is go back out to the darkroom and see what happens if I try printing some quality new negatives shot with a good camera on film that's been well kept and see how the old paper performs then. All I just need to be aware of is to filter the contrast differently and tweak the exposure. So before I wrap this up, I want to go ahead and do that and see what the results look like. So back in the darkroom, we're going to use a new negative that is actually also Kodak T-Max 400, just more recent T-Max 400. And the picture we're going to be printing is something I shot on a vacation a while back when we could still do those things, of the LA Metro Rail. There was this station near the hotel that we usually stay at when we visit Los Angeles area, at least to see family down there. And there was this overhead station nearby, so I took some pictures of it. Now, those graphs told me the old paper probably needs an extra grade of contrast, though I didn't bother to test it at more than just grade 2, so probably start with grade 3 on this. And it was surprisingly more sensitive, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But let's go ahead, make some test strips, and see how they turn out. The first test strips are out of the wash, and I can already see a worlds of difference from what we got yesterday. Both strips were at an 8.66 second exposure. The top one with the enlarger lens at f5.6, the bottom one with the enlarger lens at f8. I do kind of have a bright enlarger, so yeah, take that for what it's worth. They are also in quarter stop increments centered on the middle. I'm thinking of probably going somewhere around here or here for my first full test print. Looks around good. And let's see how that turns out. Wow, I'm actually kind of impressed. So this is the straight print with the settings from those previous test strips. This turned out really well. The picture looks good. You know, you might nitpick how it's a little dark at the bottom and maybe a little washed out in the sky, but that's par for the course. I don't really want to go nitpicking over the dodging and burning here, though we could probably, I guess, dodge this area at the bottom a little bit. But yeah, this print is actually surprisingly good. Obviously using film that was processed when I wasn't 10 years old and was actually kept well and shot in a camera that can focus correctly makes an enormous difference. There's definitely critical sharpness in this photograph. There's no weird haze over everything. This is actually an acceptable result. I'm impressed. I feel like I might want to try a little more. But overall, yeah, this 20-year-old paper is actually usable. You just have to be aware of how it's different from the paper that isn't 20 years old. Just for kicks, I did another print where I bumped the exposure up a quarter stop and did some dodging around the train. And I think it actually came out even better. You can see some more detail in the sky and the clouds sort of intruding into the frame. Only downside is there's a few little spots on the print. I don't know where they came from that crept in, but it's still a pretty good result. Before wrapping this up, I just wanted to try one last print. This is from one of our many trips to Disneyland. It's the Columbia, which is a ship designed to look like an old sailing ship that sails around this river in the middle of the park. And I think this one also turned out pretty well. I think it's time to wrap things up. That was quite an adventure. Thank you for bearing with me on this journey through using expired materials that most people would just say from a point of authority you should never use. You should dump chemicals at the first sign they might pretend to be old. You shouldn't use old paper. Just don't, it's not worth it. Well, if you're like me and you don't like dumping things all the time, or maybe you don't feel comfortable pouring it all down the drain every time you sneeze at it, you have options. So just to sort of recap, as far as fixer, officially people love to swear by HypoCheck, but HypoCheck is a little more nitpicky than Ilford's specs actually permit. If you want to stretch your fixer a little bit longer, buy these test strips. Now, these test strips are a little pricey, and fixer is probably not that expensive. But again, if you think of waste and disposal maybe is more important than upfront cost, it's worth considering. Also, if you're one of those people who doesn't like having to dump a whole tray of developer every time you do a working session, like, you know, if you use this or Dectol, you probably would. Again, there are options. Maybe you just want to print a couple prints every once in a while and not have to generate all this waste every time you do it. Maybe you like to print different sizes, and those 16 by 20 trays take a lot of chemistry, and you don't want to dump 3 to 4 liters of the stuff just because you wanted to make one big print. Well, this developer is absolutely great for that. Again, it's more expensive, but it lasts forever. The working solution of this is supposed to be good for up to 8 months. And I've shown that it can actually work a year out as long as you compensate on exposure. So if you buy this and mix a whole big chug and just use what you need, you can print basically any size you have trays for whenever you feel like. The only downside is the paper might take 3 minutes instead of 1 minute to be done in the developer step, which can get a little annoying, but you can deal with it. Finally, about paper. Old paper, new paper. The old paper still works. Its characteristics are just a little bit different. So if you use an enlarging meter, you'd have to recalibrate it for the old paper. But you might as well not bother because this is a once in a while and this isn't all the time. But as with this old paper, I can't help but wonder if Ilford changed the formulation, because I did not expect the old paper to actually be more sensitive than the new paper of the same product. That didn't make any sense. Also, the contrast was completely different. So it's not clear what's due to age and what's due to just differences out of the factory, because I would expect the sensitivity to go down, not up. But yeah, this old box of paper that I bought for a photo class in 1998 is still usable. Now, the truth is I'm not really using either of these papers anymore because I really like Ilford's Generation 5 paper a lot better. And now I've actually quantified what happens if I use this paper, this developer, and a working solution I mixed up a year ago. It loses a little bit of sensitivity, but otherwise the characteristic curve is identical. So, should I go ahead and dump all my chemicals and mix fresh ones before I do any more serious printing? Yeah, probably. But could I get away without it for quick and dirty stuff? Of course! So, this has been an interesting exploration of what happens when you use old materials and see if they still work. Oh yeah, and I've also reaffirmed my hatred for the 28mm fixed focus point and shoot cameras everybody had when I was a kid. The difference between, you know, their output and a proper camera is night and day. In any case, I think that's enough for now. Please like, share, subscribe. I'll try to put some relevant links in the description, and have a nice day. Bye.